Thanks very much indeed. And actually, as well, I guess the PowerPoint. I have to do something.
Forward, and it will eventually get to yours. There you go.
The actually, I think Alan's fascinating presentation there has given me reason just to go off-piste right from the start. So don't worry, Paolo, about the 20 minutes, but we'll probably stick to that.
Long lost anyway.
Yeah. So I think that and the Auditor General also, and I think that the sort of the one of the very strong points from both of those is that an over-reliance on formal rules is missing so much of the wood for the trees, that that a lot of the fundamental questions about managerial determination, about innovation, that managing through agency, leadership, the role of politics are fundamental in this, and to imagine that we can sort of move to a world where a sort of sufficient set of complex algorithms will drive better results is a bizarre proposition. And as a non-public financial management specialist, then I'm sort of relieved that we've sort of got that, we've come out of that particular closet. So we're agreeing that we're unlikely to see the perfect app that will drive this thing. I want to pick up on a couple of I'm still off piste, by the way. I will come back on, but I want to pick up on a couple of points that Alan made specifically, and he noted the role that has been played in this sort of development of certainty about budget process reforms. For that, there's arisen within the OECD countries and declining trust. And I'd just like to nuance that a little bit. I mean, what we know about trust in government is that certainly there's been a tremendous problem within OECD countries. That's unambiguous. But actually, it's rather complicated. That if we look at what seems to drive improvements in trust, then in middle-income countries, then the survey evidence suggests that service delivery improvements can actually make people trust government more. There is some hope from service delivery improvements. If you're looking for a political return, you can get something from it. In low-income countries, then the corruption and fairness, right, are by far the biggest drivers in terms of improvements in trust in government. In the OECD countries, you haven't got that. The low-hanging fruit in terms of service delivery improvements have already been picked. We've got a sort of post-war generations that are sort of, I don't mean this in the sort of right-wing sense, but I mean certainly they are entitlement generations. They take it for granted in terms of how services should be. There's some sort of big existential questions that hang over about the prospects for social mobility, global warming, those sorts of things. None of these can be fixed. You can't improve trust in government in the short term by addressing any of those questions. They're not tractable, right? So the levers for government in OECD countries to improve their trust, are really far more limited than they are in other economic groups. And maybe one of the consequences, and I think this is what maybe Alan was getting at, one of the consequences is that we see this sort of curious phenomenon within the OECD countries where public management has become a policy domain in its own right. It's no longer what does public management reform do, it's what you believe about public management. And we can see this, that the fact that it's now it's an allowable dinner party topic. If you think about just the sort of the volume of publications, the types of government units that now are devoted to this, 40, 50 years ago, who was doing admin reform or public management reform within government in OECD countries? Somewhere deep in the bowels of the Cabinet Office, there was somebody who was worried about organisational charts for something or other, and maybe there was a couple of other people anguishing about grade 3B for the porter class. But it was a minor subsidiary question. It wasn't something that you did for its own sake. Now it's become a sort of a domain where positions are taken, and we end up with this sort of this curious certainty. And as Alan says, this sort of rational framework and success in that world, right? What I'm suggesting here, by the way, is that sort of somehow this point that we're exporting OECD reforms, that's undoubtedly right, but it's more that there's an OECD way of looking at this so which we're exporting, and that OECD way of looking at it, exactly as Alan is saying, is very much to do with sort of rationality. Success, it's not success in the racing car sense of like who won the race. Success is to do with the beauty of the theory, the rationality of the framework, the sort of the elegance of the PowerPoint. Right? Yeah. That's really where success is coming from. I mean, where I depart from Alan a little bit is I think that he runs the risk, I think, of Renault, the sin that Renault identified, which was suggesting that sort of basics first is a certainty, right? Yeah. And I fear that actually things are far more complex than that, and we no longer know that that's absolutely true either. But our sin is in sort of obsessing about the, and I absolutely agree with Alan on this. Our sin is it's sort of obsessing about the rationality. Our sin is in looking purely at the machinery rather than at the results. So now coming back onto the track briefly. Then I mean I cheated quite a bit. So the question was, and Paolo, you put this on the beginning: why should we care about improving budgeting in the real world? And I didn't really know how to answer that, so I sort of looked at a different question, which is that...
Typical.
If we care about improving budgeting in the real world, then why are we apparently so unconcerned with experience, and what can we do about that? Why are we learning so slowly, or why are we learning so little? And then I cheated even further, because the we... Right. Then I'm afraid I reduce it very much to the bank, and there's sort of three reasons for this rather poignant navel gazing. First is that's sort of all I know about, so that's we have to talk about our own experience. The second is that there's obviously bank hubris, what we think is crucially important about ourselves. But the third issue, and it's a more sort of significant point, is that we're just as many of the bank colleagues here know, we're just launching a huge restructuring within the bank, which is going to give us a governance practice of about 700 staff, right? This is a huge body. How do we make this into a group of people that actually believe, that operationalize this idea that experiential learning really does matter? That you don't just read the book and then go out there and say how it should be done, that you actually learn as you go. How would we do it? Why aren't we doing it now? Right, and how will we do it in the future? Why won't we have 700 people instead of, a couple of hundred people going out with their PowerPoint certainties? What's going to be different? So there is quite a sort of practical edge to this. When Paolo saw the PowerPoint, he was foolishly, he looked through it, he said last night, and he was alarmed about the timing, and I'm already now down to 10 minutes left. The bad news of having very little time to prepare is that you're all going to see something. It's the equivalent of a sort of teleprompter notes. And actually, as I try and read it at this distance, I'm hoping that works. So my only real point on this, and I don't know whether you can see the cartoon here, is that there is a pretty significant gap in our knowledge. Yeah. And we don't seem to be trying to fill it in, and it's not because of lack of commitment. There's something about the way that we approach the task, right, that makes us surprisingly disinterested in learning. And in fact, of course, that learning, that evidence, is even more important. I mean, previously, evidence about what works has really been the basis for this idea of what project, what reform should be selected. These things work, therefore do more of them. If we move into a world of more sort of adaptive projects, then we need far more granular knowledge. We need far more granular learning about how does this thing tend to play out when you see this set of circumstances? How do actors often work in these circumstances? Our need for learning as we become more PDIA-ish or whatever it is that we're becoming, right? If anything goes up, right? This isn't an area where we need fewer skills, fewer technical knowledge. It's an area where we need more, but at a more granular level. So very, very quickly, and I really am going to flash through these, and as I say, think of these very much as sort of teleprompter notes. The bank does a huge amount of work that is under the heading of PFM reform, the essence of what this. Actually, I have to look over there because it's got bigger writing. I can I can see it there, right? But then it seems a bit rude. The essence here is that I mean a very significant proportion of overall bank lending has got the label public financial management on it, and it went up even more immediately after the financial sector crisis, and actually that was sort of curious. I mean, partly it was deficit financing, but also, and this was the point that Matt raised, it was suddenly we saw the need to help build basic capacities for something where the horse had long since bolted, right? You know, so we got very, very panicky about a thing that had already happened, and then we went back to business as usual. But anyway, but we do a lot of this stuff. Is the basic story, and we're in the top right, which is the good cell in terms of use of country systems. So we're on the right side of things there, where of course the proportion of budget support makes that relatively easy, since that's, you know, budget support is automatically using country systems. Our rhetoric, and to some degree our practice, I mean, you know, we've really tried. It has sort of evolved in step with development thinking. So if you look at the sort of history of bank strategies in this area, then, I mean, you can see this real shift from a sort of 1960s notion of the problem. It's a sort of hydraulic problem. They haven't got enough of stuff. They haven't got enough money. They haven't got enough capacity. They haven't got enough something. And then we bring the stuff, and then it's all better, right? You can really see the evolution from that notion of sort of gap filling through to now a far more sort of greater concern for context. And this idea that the external environment, and again, this was one of Alan's points about the sort of rising expectations, then external environment really can drive change. And we made a big point of this in an approach or a strategy paper the bank put out a couple of years back, which it sort of summarised where it was at in its thinking on public sector management reforms in general. And the key point here was, and again, very much we gained from Matt's thinking in a bunch of this. I mean, very much of this was around this idea of start with a functional problem, right? Explain the status quo. It appears to be a functional problem, but it's not a problem for everybody. Who does this problem, whose interests does the problem serve? The politics of this situation, and also the sort of very strong sort of pragmatic edge to it about sort of, you know, find where the shoe pinches most, and really try and concentrate on fixing that. Don't imagine that you're going to fix every single thing. But then if we ask the question, well, so what are we getting for all this? Then really it comes down to sort of two broad types of questions. One is, what do we know about what we're doing that actually does change the systems? And then the second part is, well, having changed those systems in that particular way, so what? Right, you know, is it that all that we've done is that in some ways we've sort of beautified the centre of government, that we've sort of, you know, we've produced clearer, crisper manuals? Have we produced a system change, which is typically the output of our projects, that then is associated in some way with better development outcomes? And yes, and knowledge about these steps I mentioned earlier is now doubly important as we get into more sort of adaptive lending forms. So on that first step, so what are we learning about the difference that we make in the systems themselves? And I'd mentioned as part of a question earlier this morning that it turns out that our public financial management projects, they really perform about as well as any other type of project in the bank. On the left-hand side, they're compared just in absolute terms. On the right-hand side, they're compared when they're matched with similar projects in similar countries, and the simple fact is that any statistical difference disappears. So on the raw numbers, public financial management projects do slightly worse than bank projects typically. But when you match them for and control for country context, then they're about the same, right? So just purely in terms of what we're able to do, you know, we're neither better nor worse at this stuff than we are in terms of what we're trying to do in any of our health or education or transport projects. Matt has done a lot of work on the what this then looks like, and we know very well that the sort of successes here are very unbalanced, so that they tend to be the concentrated upstream successes that, I mean, surprise, surprise, that we're a lot better in sort of fixing things that are very close to the Ministry of Finance in the national capital than we are in terms of some of the execution issues that are way out in the districts or in the sectors. We've got a bunch of sort of attribution problems. So from some work that Ivor has been doing, we know that where we do a lot of work, then PFA scores tend to improve. But I mean, you know, we can claim that one either way. So you know, was it just that we chose the countries to do work in where things were headed the right way? I mean, the attribution issues are inescapable in all this, right? Ditto in terms of some of the work that IEG, our evaluation group, has done, looking at where there's been intensive periods of public financial management project input from the bank, and then the improvements on in CPIA. And I mean, I won't take you through all the details here, but I mean, the long and the short is that the report where CPIA for public financial management has improved, then they tend to be settings where we've done a lot of work. But which way, again, which way did the causality run there? Our case-specific evidence, and this is an area where we have to do vastly better, our case-specific evidence, so that's, up till now I've been talking about the comparative data, but our case-specific evidence, it's voluminous. I mean, we churn this stuff out, but it's really not systematic. It's very hard to know how to add it all up. So we produce a lot of very rich, very detailed stories, but whether we're really able to aggregate this into a larger picture really isn't clear. And just to note in passing, with I hope a sort of, you know, a heavy loading of irony, that the sort of curious case of transparency. So we're doing a lot of work on transparency, the bank's Boost tool, which sort of unpacks the actual budget execution figures, a lot of work in terms of open budget data. But of course, one of the challenges there is that the fact of doing it is victory. Right, you know, so if we get out a Boost study, so we show the data in relation to a particular sector or a particular region or a particular country, then that's the output of the project. But we say, well, that's also the outcome, because what we wanted to do was to be transparent, and we've helped them be transparent. The second stage here, so that's how patchy we are in terms of understanding what it is that we're achieving in terms of public financial management systems. The second part of the question is, so what? So if those systems are improved, are they linked to any improvements in development outcomes? And responding to a point that several people have made earlier, and again, Alan was very robust about this, the MTEFs, which apparently provoked very strong feelings. The recent work that the bank has done on this, the econometric work, suggests that they really are causally associated with improvements in fiscal balance. Right, so there's a very strong claim that's being made there. There's also some work that's been done suggesting that there is or certainly can be a causal connection between some of the fiscal transparency work and other development objectives. There's some event studies that have looked at, again, you can't sort of, you know, this is, it's suggestive rather than sort of absolute, but suggesting that medium-term budget frameworks really do seem to have preceded some improvements in development outcomes. And again, in questions I can sort of go into the detail behind some of this. But again, you can always make the proposition, well, somehow we sensed which way it was all going, and so then we did our work in countries that were headed the right way. Okay, now the question, and I've got just 3 minutes. Why is our evidence and learning lacking? Right, what is it we can do about it? Right. Well, I mean, the obvious point, the overarching point, is that this is incredibly complicated territory. Right. It's really, really tough to think through even the sort of conceptual model that we're using to try and track this results chain to get some clarity on that, right? You know, so it's hardly surprising that it's very difficult, right? We've also got a problem that that information in this area is very, very expensive to collect. Right? It's not just a question of selecting the ideal indicators or choosing the perfect type of case study or discourse analysis. to actually get good quality data is very, very expensive. PFAS studies, Nicola will know more than me as to what the sort of, what the average cost is. But I mean, these are very, very costly exercises to do. You don't just dream up a data set and then say, now let's complete a spreadsheet of this. To get teams to quality assure these data, it's a long process. So we've got some inherent difficulties in terms of sort of how it is that we learn in this area. But there's some dimensions that suggest that maybe there's a couple of other things though that are sort of going on here, right? And this is very much, and again, forgive me for being so sort of inward looking at this. There's a bunch of stuff about incentives, and the incentives that are on us to learn as we go. There's a bunch of stuff about collective action. Why should we bother to do this stuff if it's not only going to help us? And there's also just some key issues about sort of awareness and how deep some of this thinking about adaptive approaches really goes. So very quickly, I'm just going to finish on these, both the sort of problems here and how we might make some progress. Where this is coming from is that typically we're applying, we're increasingly focused on behavioral economics in terms of how we work with clients, but really the question is, what type of nudges would be useful for us? Right. And the incentive problems within the bank is that, and by extension, I mean I don't mean to rope other donors in exactly into our difficulties, but I mean I think it's probably fairly reasonable to generalize on this, right? Yeah, our incentive is very much to do with getting the project through. Right, why do you want to learn in this? Get your project done, for heaven's sake. That's complicated enough. I mean, why add your difficulties by trying to extract some meaning from it, right? The one possible way forward on this, and it came up a little bit this morning, but I mean, I'm sure there'll be more discussion about this, is to change some of the incentives there and to develop stronger country challenges to donor offerings. What is the evidence base for your proposed intervention? What's behind the PowerPoint? What's behind this project document that you're offering us? How can we, in a sense, create more incentives for us to want to find out more about how often this is true, how often this stuff works, and also how often it works here? Some nudging issues in terms of how it is that we work. Right now, gathering data or case studies, as I mentioned, it's very expensive. It's very difficult, and ultimately, really, why should we contribute to sort of collective efforts when, at the end of the day, we're worried about our own track record, right? What's the value added here? And to some degree, we can't fix a bunch of that. We can't stop the reality that the political principles behind different donors are very, very different. I mean, principals, right? So we're serving very, very different principles in that way. But we can make it a little bit easier. So in the same way that if the way that the candies are arranged next to the checkout in the supermarket, right? If we made it easier for staff to access the comparative data that are already there, and if we made it easier for them to upload, for staff and government counterparts to provide data and explain what they've got in particular areas, it doesn't mean that it's automatically going to happen, but it does mean it's more likely to happen. At the moment, you have to go a long way out of your way. The candy bars are put somewhere at the back of the supermarket behind the dairy counter. If we could put them right by the counter, let's just make it a little bit easier to develop data and to share it. And then finally, and this gets to an issue that many people have talked about, although in theory, in principle, our approaches have changed enormously, then that insight, it hasn't penetrated completely. And the table that's up there that might be a little too small for many people to see, this again, I referred to it this morning, this makes a simple distinction between the types of indicators we use in projects and drawing the distinction between behavioral indicators that capture where an agent or an agency, where they're now demonstrably and observably doing something different. You can actually see it, right? Versus indicators that are catching laws or regulations that are just there in abstract, but you don't really know what they led to. then our development and policy operations, then over 90% are non-behavioral in terms of the indicators that we use. There's a bunch of reasons for that, but it also, it's not only to do with the sort of the insights involved and the importance of actual solving functional problems, but it's also suggestive that sort of some of the insights about this really haven't gone as deep as we might want. And one issue here, one possible response, is that to problematize this issue, we need to certainly within the bank maybe to think about sort of procedural challenges for purely form-based metrics whenever they get incorporated into project design. So a possible moral of the story, and I think I'm nearly within time actually, then is nearly right, yeah. And to me, I think that our failure to learn at the wholesale level, the development problem is our failure to learn, right? And that to me seems that certainly just let's say from a sort of bank point of view, that if we could solve that, if we can motivate, nudge, reframe the problem so that we're more active learners, right, then we might make more difference in an area which really, again, just to go full circle, is not amenable to a simple certainty about this is always the right way forward. Thanks very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Nick. Most of all for your very candid navel gazing, and I was quite struck by your observation that with the bank's new restructuring exercise, there might be a cadre of several hundred people having to think and work on these issues on a daily basis. I mean, that's more than 20 times the size of the organization that I work in. So certainly sounds very impressive to me. What do we do with that amount of human capacity and human effort, and how do we try and turn it around in ways that help us think and do better in this area? I know that by now most of you are burning to ask questions, if you're still awake, of course. But please hold your guns for another 5 to 10 minutes, and we'll get our discussant to help us ask the right questions.